Sapiens. This video is based on key insights from the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Chapter 1: An Animal of No Significance. Yuval Noah Harari begins a fascinating story about how humans came to be the most important creatures on Earth. It all started a long, long time ago, about 13.5 billion years ago, with the Big Bang. That's when everything matter, energy, time, and space suddenly appeared. After that, things started to get complicated, with tiny bits of stuff called atoms forming, and then those atoms joining together to make molecules. This whole process of how atoms and molecules work is what scientists call chemistry. Then, around 3.8 billion years ago, on our planet Earth, something amazing happened. Molecules started to build bigger and more complex things called organisms. That's what we call living things. Studying these organisms and how they live is called biology. For a long time, Earth was full of all sorts of creatures, but they weren't very special. They were just part of the world, like gorillas or fireflies. But about 2.5 million years ago, a new kind of animal appeared, animals that looked a lot like us. They were called archaic humans. They loved, played, and argued, just like we do. They had families and competed for things, but they weren't much different from chimpanzees or baboons. They didn't realize that their children would one day do incredible things like walking on the moon or understanding how our bodies work. They were just ordinary animals, not making much of an impact on the world around them. Harari explains that scientists group animals into species. Animals are the same species if they usually have babies together. Horses and donkeys look similar, but they don't usually have babies together. If they do, the baby, called a mule, can't have babies of its own. That means horses and donkeys are different species. Dogs, like bulldogs and spaniels, can have puppies together, so they are the same species. Scientists also use a special naming system for animals. They give each animal a two-part name, like Panthera leo for a lion. Panthera is the genus, which is like a family name, and Leo is the species, which is the animal's specific name. We humans are called Homo sapiens. Homo is our genus, meaning man, and sapiens means wise. Just like lions belong to the cat family, humans belong to a larger family called the great apes. Our closest relatives are chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. It's a surprising fact, but we share a common ancestor with these animals. A long time ago, one female ape had two daughters. One daughter's descendants became chimpanzees, and the other daughter's descendants became us. But here's a secret that humans haven't always wanted to admit. We used to have many more cousins, other types of humans. For a long time, we thought we were the only humans, but that's not true. There were other species of humans, like Homo neanderthalensis, who lived in Europe and Asia. These Neanderthals were strong and muscular, well-suited for the cold weather. There was also Homo erectus, who lived in Asia for almost 2 million years. That's a really long time. And on a small island called Flores, humans evolved to be very small, only about 3.5 feet tall. Scientists called them Homo floresiensis. Even more recently, scientists found a fossilized finger bone in Siberia that belonged to a completely new type of human called Homo denisova. It seems like there were many different kinds of humans living on Earth at the same time. It's like having several different kinds of foxes, bears, or pigs living together. Harari points out that humans have really big brains compared to other animals. While a normal mammal has a brain of about 12 cubic inches, humans have brains that are much larger, around 73 to 85 cubic inches. Big brains need a lot of energy, and it took a long time for humans to evolve brains that were this big. It's also important to remember that having a big brain can be a problem. It takes a lot of energy to power a big brain, and it can make it harder to give birth to babies with big heads. Humans also walk upright on 2 legs, which freed up our hands to use tools. Making and using tools is a key thing that makes humans special. But walking upright also caused problems, like backaches and difficult childbirth. Over time, humans learned to control fire. Fire gave us warmth, light, and a way to cook food. Cooking food made it easier to digest and gave us more energy. which helped our brains grow even bigger. Fire also allowed humans to spread out and live in different places. Eventually, Homo sapiens became the only human species left on Earth. Harari wonders what would have happened if Neanderthals or other human species had survived. Would we have different cultures and religions? Would we still think of ourselves as being so special? It's a fascinating question to think about. Harari concludes that even though humans have big brains and use tools, we didn't become truly powerful until we learned to control fire and work together. For millions of years, humans were just ordinary animals, living in fear of predators and struggling to survive. But then something changed, and humans began to conquer the world. Chapter 2: The Tree of Knowledge. Yuval Noah Harari begins by explaining that even though Homo sapiens looked like us and had brains as big as ours, they weren't always so different from other human species living on Earth. For a long time, they didn't do anything special, didn't make better tools, and didn't seem to have a big advantage. He points out a surprising fact. When early sapiens first met Neanderthals, the Neanderthals actually won. Some sapiens tried to move into Neanderthal territory, but they couldn't stay and eventually had to go back. Harari wonders why these early sapiens didn't seem as smart as we are today. He suggests their brains might have been wired differently, making it hard for them to learn new things or understand complex ideas. He imagines trying to teach them English or explain science. It would be nearly impossible. But then, around 70,000 years ago, something amazing happened. Sapiens started doing things no one had ever seen before. They left Africa again, and this time, they didn't just move into new areas. They took over, pushing other human species out of existence. They quickly spread across the world, even reaching Australia by building boats. During this time, they invented important things like boats, oil lamps, bows and arrows, and needles for sewing clothes. They also started creating art, like the famous Lion Man statue, and showing signs of religion, trade, and different social groups. Harari believes this was because of a big change in how sapiens thought and communicated. He calls it the cognitive revolution. He thinks a random change in their DNA, like a tiny switch flipping, gave them new abilities. He playfully calls this change the tree of knowledge mutation. He then explores what made sapiens' language so special. Many animals communicate, like monkeys warning each other about eagles or lions. Even parrots can mimic human speech. But sapiens' language was different. It wasn't just about warning about danger. It was about connecting sounds and symbols to create endless sentences with different meanings. This allowed them to share lots of information about the world around them. A monkey might say, "Careful, a lion." But a sapiens could describe exactly where they saw the lion, what it was doing, and how to avoid it. Harari suggests another important reason for language's development: gossip. He argues that humans are social creatures, and knowing about each other, who likes whom, who is trustworthy, who is a cheat, is vital for survival. It's easier to work together when you know who you can rely on. He points out that most of what we talk about today is gossip, even in serious places like universities or businesses. But the truly unique thing about sapiens' language, Harari explains, is the ability to talk about things that don't exist at all. Things like legends, myths, gods, and religions. While other animals can say, "Careful, a lion," sapiens could say, "The lion is our guardian spirit." This ability to create and believe in fictions is what really sets sapiens apart. He asks why believing in things that aren't real is important. It might seem silly to believe in fairies or spend time praying to spirits. But Harari argues that fiction allows us to cooperate on a massive scale. We can share common stories, like national myths or religious beliefs, that unite us even if we're strangers. Ants and bees can work together, but they only cooperate with close relatives. Wolves and chimpanzees can cooperate, but only with a few individuals they know well. Sapiens can cooperate with countless strangers because we share these imagined realities. To illustrate this, Harari tells the story of Peugeot, a car company. Peugeot exists as a legal entity, a company that employs hundreds of thousands of people and makes billions of euros. But it's not a real person or a physical thing. It's an idea, a story that everyone agrees to believe in. Just like priests believe in God and lawyers believe in laws, people believe in Peugeot, and that belief allows them to work together to build cars. He compares this to how Catholic priests create Christ's body during Mass, a ritual that relies on shared belief. Harari explains that this ability to create and believe in fictions is what allowed sapiens to build large societies, cities, and empires. He emphasizes that history, the story of how humans have changed over time, really began with the cognitive revolution. Before that, human behavior was mostly determined by genes and the environment. But after the cognitive revolution, sapiens could change their behavior quickly, adapting to new situations and inventing new ways of living. This ability to change rapidly, thanks to shared stories and beliefs, is what made sapiens so successful and allowed them to conquer the world. He concludes that while biology sets the limits of what we can do, it's our ability to create and believe in imagined realities that truly shapes our history. Chapter 3: A Day in the Life of Adam and Eve. Yuval Noah Harari begins by explaining that to truly understand who we are today, we need to think about our ancestors who lived as hunter-gatherers. For almost all of human history, people didn't live in cities or on farms. They traveled around, finding food by hunting animals and gathering plants. The last 200 years, with big cities and jobs, and even the 10,000 years of farming, are a tiny bit of time compared to the tens of thousands of years people lived this way. Scientists who study how our brains work, called evolutionary psychologists, believe that many of our habits and feelings come from this long time of hunting and gathering. Even though we live in a world of computers and airplanes, our brains still think like they're in a forest, looking for food. For example, why do we love sugary and fatty foods so much? Harari explains that a long time ago, sweet things like ripe fruit were very rare. If a Stone Age person found a tree full of figs, they would eat as many as they could because they didn't know when they would find them again. That instinct to eat a lot of sugary food is still inside us, even though we can buy candy and ice cream whenever we want. Some scientists think that our ancestors didn't live in families like we do today. They believe that people lived in groups where everyone shared everything, and no one was the father of a child. Everyone in the group would help raise the children. This idea is different from how most people live now, with mom, dad, and kids. Other scientists disagree, saying that families and couples have always been important to humans. It's a big debate, and it's hard to know what's true because there weren't any written records from that time. It's difficult to learn about how our ancestors lived because they didn't leave behind many things. They didn't build big houses or make lots of tools. Most of what they used was made of wood, which rots away over time. So when we dig up old places, we mostly find stones. This makes it seem like they only used stone tools, but really, they used a lot of wood. Harari compares our lives today to the lives of our ancestors. We are surrounded by things: cars, phones, toys, and even food. We move our stuff whenever we want. But our ancestors traveled with only what they could carry on their backs. They didn't have stores or moving companies. Because they didn't have many things, they spent a lot of time thinking and feeling without being distracted by objects. It's hard for us to imagine a life like that. Even though we can't know everything about how our ancestors lived, we can learn some things. Most people lived in small groups of a few dozen or 100 people. They moved around, following animals and plants. They knew a lot about the plants and animals around them, and they were very good at making things with their hands. They worked less than we do today, and they probably ate healthier food. Harari points out that hunter-gatherer societies were different from each other, just like countries are different today. Some groups spoke different languages, had different customs, and believed in different things. It's like having many different tribes, each with its own rules and traditions. He also talks about how humans and dogs became friends a long time ago, about 15,000 years ago. Dogs helped people hunt and protect themselves, and people took care of the dogs. They became like family. Harari suggests that even though life as a hunter-gatherer wasn't always easy, It was often better than the lives of farmers or factory workers. They had more free time, healthier food, and fewer diseases. He also mentions that sometimes hunter-gatherer groups could be violent, but that's true of people in all kinds of societies. Finally, Harari says that it's important to remember that there wasn't just one, natural, way for humans to live. Ever since people started using their imaginations and creating stories, they've been able to choose different ways of living. Our ancestors made choices about how to live, and we continue to make choices today. Even though we have forgotten much about their lives, they shape the world we live in now. Chapter 4: The Flood. Before people could travel far, the entire human population lived in one big area, Afroasia, which includes Africa and Asia. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans stayed close to home, only venturing to nearby islands like Flores. They could swim or use simple rafts, but the ocean was a big barrier. Many animals and plants couldn't cross it either, so places like Australia and Madagascar developed their own unique plants and animals, different from those in Afroasia. It was like Earth was divided into separate, special worlds. But then something amazing happened: the cognitive revolution. This is when humans started thinking in new ways, inventing tools, and working together better. Suddenly, humans had the skills and ideas to leave Afroasia and explore the rest of the world. One of the first big steps was traveling to Australia about 45,000 years ago. It was a huge challenge because they had to cross long stretches of ocean, and the new land was very different from what they knew. Harari explains that the people living in the Indonesian islands were likely the first to become skilled sailors. They learned to build boats and fish in the ocean, becoming explorers. This was a big change because most animals that live in the sea need a very long time to evolve special body parts for swimming. Humans, however, built boats instead of growing flippers. These boats allowed them to reach Australia and other islands. Even though we haven't found old boats or fishing villages from that time, the ocean has covered them up. There's strong evidence that they were sailing long distances. Reaching Australia was a really important moment in history, just as important as when Christopher Columbus sailed to America. It was the first time humans, and really the first big animal, crossed from Afroasia to Australia. But even more important was what happened after they arrived. The first humans in Australia didn't just adapt to the new environment, they changed it completely. Australia was full of giant animals like kangaroos that weighed 450 pounds, huge lions, giant koalas, and birds bigger than ostriches. These animals were marsupials, meaning they carried their babies in pouches. These animals had never seen humans before, so they weren't afraid. Sadly, within a few thousand years, almost all of these giant animals disappeared. It was a huge loss for the Australian ecosystem. Some people think that the animals died out because of changes in the weather, but Harari argues that humans were probably the main reason. He points out that humans arrived in Australia right when the animals started to disappear. Also, when humans settled other places like New Zealand and Wrangel Island, the large animals there disappeared too. It seems like wherever humans went, the big animals didn't last long. Harari explains that even with simple Stone Age tools, humans could hunt these large animals. Big animals have fewer babies and take longer to grow up, so even hunting just a few animals regularly could wipe them out. Also, humans used fire to change the land, burning forests to create grasslands where they could easily hunt. This changed the plants and animals that could live there, and many animals couldn't survive. It was a combination of hunting and changing the land that led to the extinction of Australia's giants. This wasn't just a one-time event. As humans spread around the world, they caused similar extinctions in America and on islands everywhere they went. Harari says that humans have been the biggest cause of animal extinctions throughout history, even before we had advanced technology. It's a sad story, but it shows how powerful humans are and how much we can change the world around us. He hopes that by understanding this history, we can be more careful about protecting the animals and plants that are still alive today. Chapter 5: History's Biggest Fraud. For a very long time, People got their food by finding plants and hunting animals. It was a simple life. People like Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and even our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, wandered around, picking berries and chasing after wild sheep. They didn't decide where plants would grow or where animals would live. They just took what they could find. They moved from Africa to many different places: the Middle East, Europe, Asia, Australia, and America, and everywhere they went, they still lived this way. It worked well enough, and it gave them time for fun things like stories, games, and figuring out how the world worked. Then, about 10,000 years ago, something big changed. People started spending almost all their time taking care of just a few kinds of plants and animals. Instead of wandering, they stayed in one place and planted seeds, watered plants, and moved sheep to good grassy areas. They thought this would give them more food. This was a huge change in how people lived, and it's called the agricultural revolution. It started slowly, in places like Turkey, Iran, and a region called the Levant. People began to tame plants like wheat and lentils, and animals like goats and sheep. It took a long time, thousands of years. Even today, most of the food we eat comes from those same plants our ancestors started growing so long ago. It's amazing that we still rely on them. At first, people thought the agricultural revolution came from one place, the Middle East. But now, scientists know that it happened in other places too, like Central America, South America, China, and North America. People in these places figured out how to grow their own food, like corn and potatoes, without knowing anything about what was happening in the Middle East. It was like everyone discovered farming at the same time, but in different parts of the world. Why did farming only happen in certain places? Because not all plants and animals can be farmed. You can't really teach a mushroom to grow where you want it, or make a woolly mammoth behave like a sheep. Only a few plants and animals are easy to control and grow. Those few lived in places where farming could start. A long time ago, people thought the agricultural revolution was a great step forward. They believed that people were getting smarter and smarter, and eventually, they were clever enough to figure out how to farm. They thought people were happy and had plenty of food. But Harari says that's not true at all. He argues that people didn't get smarter, and farming actually made life harder. Hunter-gatherers knew a lot about plants and animals because their lives depended on it. Farmers worked harder, ate worse food, and were more likely to starve or get sick. It's true that farming made more food overall, but it didn't mean everyone had a better life. It just meant there was more food for some people, especially those in charge. Harari says the real reason for the agricultural revolution wasn't people, but plants like wheat, rice, and potatoes. These plants tricked humans into working for them. Think about it, 10,000 years ago, wheat was just a wild grass. Now, it grows almost everywhere in the world. Wheat became so successful because it got humans to do all the work for it. Humans cleared rocks, pulled weeds, watered the plants, and even collected animal poop to fertilize the soil. Our bodies weren't even made for this kind of work. Farming caused back problems, arthritis, and other aches and pains. People had to settle down near their fields, which changed their lives completely. Harari says we didn't domesticate wheat, wheat domesticated us. The word domesticate means to tame something, and wheat got humans to build houses and settle down. You might think wheat gave people a better diet, but it didn't. People used to eat all sorts of different foods. Grains weren't a big part of their diet. A diet based on grains isn't very healthy. It also didn't make people safer. Farmers were often attacked by other farmers who wanted their land. And if a crop failed, farmers could starve. So what did wheat offer? It didn't offer anything to individuals. But it did help humans have more babies. When there's more food, people can have more children, and more children mean more people. This is how wheat helped humans become the most numerous species on Earth. Harari points out that evolution isn't about making people happy. It's about making more copies of DNA. The more copies of DNA, the more successful a species is. So, even though farming made life harder for many people, it helped humans multiply and spread across the globe. It's a strange idea, but it's true. He uses the example of a little girl in ancient China. If her father's crops failed, she might starve. But her suffering helped make sure that more humans lived on. It's a bit sad to think about, but it's the way evolution works. Harari explains that the agricultural revolution was a trap. People started farming thinking it would make their lives easier, but it actually made them work harder and depend on a few plants. It's like a luxury that becomes a necessity. Think about all the things we have today that we think make our lives easier, like computers and phones. But do they really make us more relaxed? Sometimes they just make us busier. He concludes that the agricultural revolution wasn't a great leap forward. It was a deal with plants and animals that changed the world forever, and not always for the better. It's a reminder that sometimes the things we think are progress can have unexpected and difficult consequences. Chapter 6: Building Pyramids. Yuval Noah Harari explores a really big question in this chapter. Did the agricultural revolution actually make things better for people? Some people think it was amazing, leading to all the things we have today. Others believe it was a mistake, a turning point where humans lost their connection to nature and started wanting more and more things. Harari explains that, no matter which side you believe, there's no going back. Around 10,000 years ago, the world was very different. There were only about 5 to 8 million people, and they were nomads, meaning they moved around a lot, hunting animals and gathering plants for food. They knew their territory really well, sometimes covering huge areas. But then something changed. People started farming. This meant growing their own food instead of just finding it. Suddenly, the number of people on Earth exploded. By the time the Romans were around, there were about 250 million farmers, dwarfing the number of nomads who were mostly in places like Australia, America, and Africa. Farming allowed people to settle down in one place. Before, nomads might roam across many miles. But farmers mostly stayed in a small area, working a field or an orchard. They built small houses, and they started to feel really attached to them. It wasn't just about having a roof over their heads, it was a change in how people thought. They started to think of my house and my land as important, and they became more focused on themselves and their little piece of the world. Farmers didn't just settle down, they also changed the land. Nomads didn't really change their surroundings much. But farmers cut down forests, dug canals to bring water, and planted crops in neat rows. They built fences to keep out wild animals and weeds. It was like they were creating little islands for themselves, just for humans and their plants and animals. Farmers were constantly fighting against anything that tried to grow where they didn't want it, even tiny bugs. At first, these farming areas were small compared to the whole world. The Earth is huge, but for a long time, most farmers only used about 2% of the land for growing food. Everywhere else was too cold, too hot, or just not good for farming. But that small 2% is where all of human history happened. Because farmers had to stay in one place to tend their crops, they couldn't just pick up and leave easily. They had houses, fields, and storage for their food. Plus, over time, they started collecting more and more things: pots, tools, furniture, things that were hard to carry around. Even though farmers might seem like they didn't have much, they actually owned more stuff than a group of nomads did. Harari then talks about how farming changed how people thought about time. Nomads didn't worry too much about next month or next year. They lived day by day, figuring out where to find food. But farmers had to think ahead. They had to plan for the seasons, knowing that they would have a long time of working hard, followed by a short time of harvesting. They had to worry about what would happen if there was a drought or a flood. Farmers had to store up food because they knew bad years could happen. If they didn't have enough grain and oil stored away, they might starve. This worry about the future made farmers very busy and anxious. They were always working, planting trees that wouldn't give fruit for years, just to make sure they would have enough food later. Because farming was so important, it led to bigger and more organized societies. People started living in larger villages, then towns, and finally cities. But to make these bigger groups work, they needed rules and ways to cooperate. It wasn't enough to just have food. People needed to agree on how to share it, solve problems, and deal with emergencies. Harari points out that humans didn't evolve to live in huge groups. For millions of years, people lived in small bands of just a few dozen individuals. So, when farming created huge cities and empires, people had to invent new ways to cooperate. They used stories, myths, and beliefs to bring everyone together. Think about it. How do millions of strangers agree to follow the same rules? They believe in the same things. Ancient people used myths about gods and spirits to make people cooperate. Today, we have things like countries, money, and laws. These aren't real in the same way that a tree is real, but they're powerful because we all believe in them. Harari gives examples like the Code of Hammurabi, an ancient set of laws from Babylon, and the American Declaration of Independence, which talks about freedom and equality. Both of these documents tell people how to behave and what to believe in, and they've helped shape societies for thousands of years. He then asks a thought-provoking question: are these ideas really true? The Code of Hammurabi said that some people were better than others. The American Declaration of Independence said that everyone is equal. But are those things really true? Harari argues that they're not. They're just stories we tell ourselves to make it possible to live together. He explains that even ideas like equality aren't based on biology. Everyone is different, but we believe in equality because it helps us create a better society. The same is true for other imagined orders, like money and nations. They aren't real in a physical sense, but they're incredibly important because we all believe in them. Harari concludes that to keep these imagined orders working, we need to constantly remind ourselves of the stories and beliefs that hold them together. We need true believers, people who really believe in the system, to make it work. And we need to be careful, because if people stop believing, the whole thing can fall apart. It's like a giant puzzle, and everyone has to play their part to keep it from falling down. Chapter 7: Memory Overload. Yuval Noah Harari explores a fascinating idea. Humans weren't naturally born to play games like pick-up basketball. Our bodies evolved to run and use our hands, but playing a team sport requires something more understanding and agreeing on rules. Think about puppies playing. They just tumble and wrestle without needing instructions. But teenagers playing basketball need to know the rules, and everyone needs to agree to follow them. This shared understanding of the game, even though it's imaginary, allows them to play together. This idea isn't just about basketball. It applies to bigger things like kingdoms, churches, and trade. These large groups of people need rules too, but they're much more complicated than basketball rules. It's hard for one person to remember all the rules for a big kingdom, like how to collect taxes or build roads. Ants and bees have big groups too, but their rules are built into their bodies, like a queen bee knowing how to lead. Humans don't have that. We need to teach our rules to our children. Harari uses the example of King Hammurabi, an ancient ruler who made laws. He didn't pass on his laws through his DNA like bees do. Instead, he had to teach his sons and grandsons the laws of his kingdom. If they forgot, the kingdom wouldn't work. It's like if everyone suddenly forgot it was illegal to steal, chaos would happen. For a long time, humans relied on their brains to remember everything. But human brains can only hold so much information, especially when dealing with big empires. Imagine trying to remember every single law, every tax payment, and every soldier's name. That's a lot for one brain. Animals like ants and bees have simple societies because their rules are in their genes. But humans needed a better way to store and share information. The ancient Sumerians, living in Mesopotamia, solved this problem by inventing writing. Before writing, information was passed down by word of mouth, which could get mixed up over time. Writing allowed them to record things accurately on clay tablets. They used symbols to represent numbers and other things, like people and goods. This was a huge breakthrough. Early writing wasn't used for stories or poems. It was mostly used for keeping track of things like taxes and trade. Imagine the first written messages. They weren't exciting tales, but lists like 29,086 measures of barley received over 37 months, signed Cushim. Cushim was likely an accountant, and he's the first person we know by name from history because of writing. Writing started with simple symbols, but it slowly evolved. Eventually, people could write down stories, laws, and even poetry. But even with writing, keeping track of everything was a challenge. Imagine a huge room filled with clay tablets. How would you find the one you need? That's where organization and training came in. Scribes, like students in ancient schools, learned how to catalog and retrieve information, just like librarians today. Later, a new kind of writing system was invented: Arabic numerals, the numbers we use today, 1, 2, 3, etc. This made math much easier and helped empires grow even bigger. Now, we have computers that use a special code of zeros and ones to store and process information. Harari suggests that this code might eventually become more powerful than humans, and that's a pretty thought-provoking idea. So, from pickup basketball to empires, shared rules and writing have been essential for humans to cooperate and build complex societies. Chapter 8: There is no justice in history. Yuval Noah Harari begins by asking a big question: how did people learn to work together in huge groups? After the agricultural revolution, humans started living in much larger communities than ever before. But our brains and bodies weren't really built for that. We don't have instincts that tell us how to cooperate with hundreds or thousands of strangers. So Harari argues humans invented something amazing: imagined orders. These imagined orders are like shared stories or beliefs that everyone in a group agrees on. They aren't real in a physical sense, but they make people act as if they are. Think of things like money, countries, or even the idea of fairness. Money isn't valuable because of what it's made of, but because we all believe it has value. Countries don't exist naturally, but we all agree they do, and that affects how we live. These imagined orders help people trust each other and work together, even if they don't know each other. However, Harari points out that these imagined orders haven't always been fair. Often, they create a system where some people have more power and advantages than others. A long time ago, in places like Mesopotamia, laws like Hammurabi's Code put people into different groups: superiors, commoners, and slaves. The superiors got the best of everything, while slaves had very little. Even in the United States, when it declared everyone was equal, there were still big problems. While some men were given freedom and rights, women and people of color were often left out. Many of the leaders who signed the Declaration of Independence owned slaves and didn't think those rights applied to them. The idea of equality didn't mean everyone had the same opportunities or resources. It mostly meant that everyone was treated the same under the law, even if the law itself wasn't fair. Harari explains that these divisions between slaves and free people, whites and blacks, rich and poor, are based on made-up ideas, not on real differences. But throughout history, people have always tried to make these made-up hierarchies seem natural and inevitable. For example, some people used to believe that slaves were naturally suited to being slaves, just as free people were naturally suited to being free. Aristotle, a famous Greek thinker, actually wrote that some people were born to be slaves. Today, we still see this happening. Some people believe that white people are naturally smarter or more hardworking than other races, even though there's no scientific proof of that. Others think that rich people are rich because they're simply more talented or diligent, ignoring the fact that being born into a wealthy family gives someone a huge advantage. Harari uses examples from around the world to show how these imagined hierarchies work. In India, the caste system divided people into groups based on their birth, with Brahmins priests at the top and Sudras servants at the bottom. People believed this system was ordained by the gods, and that each caste had a specific role to play. Similarly, in ancient China, people believed that aristocrats were made from fine soil, while commoners were made from mud, explaining their different social positions. Harari emphasizes that these hierarchies are human inventions, not natural laws. He points out that there's no real difference between a Brahmin and a Sudra, or between a slave and a free person, other than the rules and laws that people created. He argues that even though we know these hierarchies are unfair, it's hard to get rid of them. Societies seem to need some way to organize people, and often that means creating categories and ranking them. These categories help people know how to treat each other without having to get to know everyone personally. Harari uses the example of a flower shop. The shop worker doesn't need to know everything about every customer. They can quickly tell who is likely to buy expensive roses and who will only buy daisies. This is because of social cues, how people dress, their age, and other things that tell us something about their status. However, Harari also explains that abilities and talents need to be nurtured and developed. Even if someone is naturally good at something, they need opportunities to learn and practice. And even if people from different backgrounds have the same abilities, they might not have the same chances to succeed because of the rules and systems in place. He uses the example of Harry Potter, who had to go to a special school to learn magic and develop his powers. Harari concludes that societies are built on imagined hierarchies, and that these hierarchies often create unfair discrimination. While some societies have been more discriminatory than others, he argues that it's been difficult to completely eliminate discrimination. These hierarchies serve a purpose. They help people understand how to interact with each other, but they also create a vicious cycle where inequality gets passed down from generation to generation. It's a complex problem, but understanding how these imagined orders work is the first step to making things more fair. Finally, Harari touches on the hierarchy between men and women. He notes that throughout history, men have generally been valued more than women, and that this isn't based on any real biological difference. He argues that the roles and expectations assigned to men and women are largely cultural creations, and that these have changed dramatically over time. He suggests that even though we may think we understand what it means to be a man or a woman, these ideas are often based on myths and assumptions rather than on facts. Chapter 9, The Arrow of History. Yuval Noah Harari explores how human societies have grown bigger and more complicated over time. After people started farming, groups of people became larger, and the stories and rules they used to organize themselves became more detailed. These stories, myths, and beliefs helped millions of strangers work together effectively. Harari calls this network of shared ideas and rules culture. It's like a set of artificial instincts that tell us how to act and what to want. For a long time, people thought each culture was special and unchanging. They believed each group had its own way of seeing the world, and that cultures didn't really change, unless something from the outside forced them to. Think of it like this. People used to believe Samoan culture was always the same and always would be. But now, scholars understand that cultures are always changing, even without outside influence. Cultures change because they have contradictions, or things that don't quite fit together. Harari uses the example of medieval knights in Europe. They were supposed to be Christian, which meant being humble and peaceful. But they were also knights, which meant being brave warriors who fought battles and celebrated victory. It was a confusing mix. They tried to solve this problem in different ways, like going on crusades or creating groups like the Templars. These attempts to make sense of the contradictions actually changed their culture. Harari points out that we still deal with contradictions today. For example, we believe in both equality and individual freedom. Equality means everyone should be treated the same, but giving everyone complete freedom can actually make inequality worse. It's a constant balancing act, and our political history is full of attempts to figure out how to make these two ideas work together. He uses the example of how different political parties approach this issue, with Democrats often prioritizing equality and Republicans often prioritizing freedom. He explains that these contradictions aren't bad things. They're what make cultures interesting and dynamic. It's like when musicians play notes that clash. It creates tension and makes the music more exciting. Similarly, disagreements and conflicting ideas push us to think, question, and change. He suggests that people who are always looking for perfect agreement are probably missing out on important ideas. Harari says that being part of a culture means holding different, even opposing, beliefs at the same time. This can be confusing, and psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. But it's actually a good thing. It's how we learn and grow. To truly understand another culture, we shouldn't look for a perfect set of beliefs. Instead, we should look for the confusing parts, the places where the rules seem to contradict each other. That's where we can really understand what's important to them. Over a very long time, Harari argues, human cultures have been slowly moving towards becoming one big, global culture. In the past, the world was made up of many small, isolated groups of people. Imagine Tasmania, an island cut off from the rest of the world for thousands of years. They had their own wars and customs, but people in China or Mesopotamia didn't even know they existed. Even big places like America and Europe were separate worlds for a long time. Events happening in one place had no effect on the other. But gradually, these worlds started to connect. First through trade, then through empires, and finally through the spread of ideas like democracy and human rights. Harari explains that even though we talk about authentic cultures, very few truly exist anymore. Because the world is so connected, almost every culture has been influenced by others. Think about food. Many of the dishes we think of as traditional, like spaghetti or chili peppers, actually came from other parts of the world. Even Native American tribes, who were once seen as living a traditional lifestyle, adopted horses, which changed their culture dramatically. Harari concludes that while cultures still have their differences, they are all part of a single, global culture. This isn't a new idea. People have been trying to create a universal order for thousands of years, through things like money, empires, and religions. Money allows people from different backgrounds to trade with each other. Empires have brought different groups of people under the same rule. And religions have offered a shared set of beliefs that can unite people across cultures. The world is becoming more and more connected, and that's a long-term trend that's been happening for a very long time. Chapter 10, The Scent of Money. Yuval Noah Harari begins by telling a fascinating story about Hernán Cortés and his Spanish explorers arriving in Mexico in 1519. The Aztecs, the people who lived there, quickly noticed the Spanish were obsessed with a shiny yellow metal gold. The Aztecs knew gold. They used it for jewelry and sometimes even as a way to pay for things. But they usually traded things like cocoa beans or cloth. The Spanish seemed to want nothing but gold, and Cortés explained that they had a disease of the heart that only gold could cure. Harari then explains that this love of gold wasn't just a Spanish thing. Even people who were enemies with each other, like Christians and Muslims in Europe, both wanted gold. For hundreds of years, they fought wars over land and religion, destroying cities and hurting each other. But even while fighting, they marked their victories by making coins with gold and silver, showing off their power and thanking God. Interestingly, some Christian leaders even made coins with Arabic writing on them, saying, "There is no God except Allah." This shows that even during times of war, people sometimes found ways to trade and work together. Before money as we know it existed, people in small groups, like hunter-gatherers or villagers, mostly traded favors. If someone helped you hunt, you might help them fix their house later. When villages grew into cities and kingdoms, things changed. People started specializing in what they were good at. One person made shoes, another was a doctor. This was great because it meant things could be made better and faster. But it created a problem. How do you trade shoes for medicine when the shoemaker doesn't need medicine right now? Bartering, trading one thing directly for another, is hard. Imagine a farmer with lots of apples trying to trade for shoes. The shoemaker might not want apples, or might already have too many. He might want something else entirely, like a lawyer's help with a problem. It's like a complicated game of, "I'll trade you this if you trade me that." And it can take a long time to find someone who wants what you have and has what you need. Even if you find someone, you have to figure out how many apples are worth a pair of shoes, and that can be tricky. That's where money comes in. Money is anything people agree to use to trade for other things. It could be shells, cattle, or even cigarettes in a prison. The important thing is that everyone trusts it has value. Money makes trading much easier because everyone wants money, so you can trade your apples for money and then use that money to buy whatever you need. Harari explains that money didn't appear suddenly. It was a gradual change in how people thought. It's not about the coins or paper themselves, but about the shared belief that they are worth something. Cowrie shells, for example, were used as money for thousands of years in different parts of the world. Even today, most of the money in the world doesn't exist as physical coins or bills. It's just numbers on computers. He uses the example of cigarettes in prisons to show how anything can become money if people agree it has value. Even though cigarettes aren't useful for anything else, prisoners use them to trade for food, services, and even valuable items. This shows that money is all about trust and shared belief. Harari points out that money has allowed people to store wealth, transport it easily, and compare the value of different things. It's helped build big economies and connect different parts of the world. He gives the example of how gold and silver helped connect Europe and Asia, allowing trade and the exchange of goods like silk and spices. But Harari also warns that money isn't always a good thing. While it helps people cooperate, it can also lead to people valuing money more than things like family, community, or even their own morals. He says that money can change what people believe is important, sometimes in ways that aren't good for society. He concludes that understanding money means understanding both its power to connect people and its potential to change what it means to be human. He suggests that throughout history, people have tried to balance the benefits of money with the need to protect important values and traditions. Chapter 11, Imperial Visions. Yuval Noah Harari begins by exploring how empires have shaped history, even when the people within them faced defeats. He uses the story of Numancia, a small town in Spain that bravely fought against the mighty Roman Empire, to illustrate this point. Even though Numancia was eventually conquered, its story became a symbol of courage and independence for the Spanish people. Harari points out that the language, laws, and even the food of modern Spain show how much it was influenced by the Romans, even though the Numancians fought so hard to resist them. It's a reminder that even when a group loses a battle, their impact can still be felt for centuries. Harari then explains what an empire really is. It's not just about a big army or a powerful ruler. An empire needs to control many different groups of people, each with their own cultures and lands. It also needs to be able to grow and take in more territories without changing its basic structure. Think of it like a giant puzzle. An empire can add more pieces, new lands, and people without changing the overall picture. The British Empire, which once covered a huge part of the world, is a good example of this. It wasn't just one country. It included many different places and people, all connected under British rule. He challenges the common idea that empires are always bad. Throughout history, people have often called empires evil because they conquer and control others. However, Harari argues that empires have been a very common form of government for thousands of years, and they've often been quite stable. It's difficult for conquered people to break free, and even when an empire falls, another one often takes its place. He uses the example of the Middle East, which has been ruled by different empires for thousands of years, with one replacing the other. Harari explains that empires often try to convince the people they rule that they are doing it for their own good. Leaders like Cyrus the Great, the ruler of Persia, claimed they were bringing peace, justice, and better ways of life to the people they conquered. This idea that empires are bringing progress has been repeated throughout history, from the Romans to the Americans. He points out that empires often spread their culture and ideas, sometimes intentionally. To make ruling easier, empires often try to make things more uniform, like having everyone speak the same language or follow the same laws. But it's not just about making things easier for the rulers. Empires also want to seem legitimate or right to rule. So they spread their culture and ideas to show that they are bringing something valuable to the people they control. Harari illustrates this with examples like the spread of Chinese culture, the Roman language, and even the adoption of Christianity. He shows how people who were once enemies often end up adopting the culture of their conquerors, sometimes even forgetting their own traditions. He uses the story of a young Indian man who studied law in England, but was still treated unfairly because of his background, highlighting how assimilation can be a long and difficult process. He emphasizes that empires leave a lasting mark on the world, even long after they disappear. Many of the things we take for granted today, our languages, our laws, our religions, are the result of empires. He argues that it's important to understand this history, even if it's complicated and sometimes uncomfortable. Finally, Harari suggests that we might be living in a new kind of empire today, a global empire. He argues that the world is becoming more interconnected, and that powerful forces like global markets and international organizations are shaping our lives in ways that are similar to how empires used to work. He wonders if we are moving towards a future where the world is united under a single, global authority, and what that might mean for the future of humanity. Chapter 12, The Law of Religion. Yuval Noah Harari explores how people around the world have become connected throughout history, even before we had airplanes or the internet. He starts by describing bustling marketplaces in ancient Samarkand, a city in Central Asia. Imagine merchants from Syria trading beautiful silk from China, while fierce warriors from the steppes sold people as slaves. It was a place where people from all corners of the world met and exchanged goods and ideas. Harari points out that even armies, like the one led by Kublai Khan when he tried to invade Japan, were made up of people from different places working together. Soldiers from China, Korea, and even sailors from the South China Sea all followed the same leader. He then shifts to Mecca, a very important city for Muslims. Harari describes pilgrims from all over the world gathering there, speaking different languages and coming from different backgrounds, all united by their shared faith. He argues that money, powerful empires, and religion have been the biggest things that have brought people together over time. Harari explains that big groups of people can be hard to manage and sometimes feel fragile. Religion, he says, helps make these groups feel stronger by suggesting that laws and rules come from a higher power, not just from people. This makes people more likely to follow those rules. Harari defines religion as a system of beliefs and values that people think come from something bigger than themselves. He uses the example of football. Even though it has rules and traditions, everyone knows people made it up. But a religion has a belief in something beyond human control, like a god or a set of natural laws. He explains that most ancient religions were local, meaning they were specific to a certain place and its people. They didn't try to convince everyone in the world to believe the same things. However, some religions, like Islam and Buddhism, wanted to spread their beliefs everywhere. These universal religions started around 3,000 years ago and were a big change in history. They helped connect different parts of the world and brought people together in new ways. Harari then dives into how religions developed, starting with animism, where people believed spirits lived in everything: trees, rocks, animals. He explains that when people started farming, things changed. They began to own animals and plants, and they didn't need to negotiate with them anymore. This led to the rise of gods who could control things like harvests and animal fertility. People started making sacrifices to these gods, hoping for good luck. Harari suggests that these gods were created to solve a problem: how to make sure crops grew and animals had babies. He describes how polytheism, the belief in many gods, became common. People worshiped different gods for different things, like war, rain, or healing. Polytheism was often more tolerant than religions that believed only one god was real, because people could accept that others might worship different gods. Harari then discusses how some people started to believe in only one god monotheism. He explains that religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all believe in one god, but they have different ideas about what that god wants. He points out that these monotheistic religions have often been more intense and sometimes led to conflict because they believe their way is the only right way. He notes that even though monotheistic religions often condemn the worship of other gods, people often still hold onto beliefs from older, polytheistic religions. He then explores how religions have changed over time, from the worship of many gods to the belief in one god, and even to new ways of thinking that don't focus on gods at all. Harari introduces the idea of natural law religions, like Buddhism, which believe that the world is governed by natural laws, not by the whims of gods. He explains that these religions focus on understanding how the world works and living in harmony with it. He then discusses how even modern ideas, like capitalism, nationalism, and humanism, can be seen as religions because they offer a set of beliefs and values that guide people's lives. Finally, Harari examines how these different belief systems have shaped human history and how they continue to influence the world today. He suggests that even though we often think of religion as something that divides people, it has also been a powerful force for bringing them together and creating a shared sense of identity. He concludes by pondering the future of these beliefs and how they will continue to shape the human story. Chapter 13, The Secret of Success. Yuval Noah Harari explores how the world became the way it is today, a world where almost everyone on Earth is connected. He explains that this wasn't a straight line, but a bumpy journey with lots of stops and starts. It started with many small groups of people with their own unique ways of life. Then those groups grew and joined together, eventually leading to the global society we know now. Harari suggests that this process was probably going to happen eventually, just like how plants grow and spread. But he also points out that just because something happened doesn't mean it had to happen that way. Think about languages. Why is English so popular instead of Danish? Or why are there so many Christians and Muslims, but not many Zoroastrians? It's like asking why some games become super popular while others fade away. It's hard to say for sure. If we could rewind time and start over, would we end up with the same religions and cultures? We just don't know. Harari introduces two important ideas to help us think about this. The first is the hindsight fallacy. This means that when we look back at history, it's easy to think that things were meant to happen the way they did. Imagine a crossroads with many paths. At the time, all the paths look pretty similar, but one might be a little easier to walk on. People might choose that path, and it becomes the main road. But looking back, it seems like that road was always the obvious choice. However, at the time, people didn't know which path would lead where. He uses the example of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity. In the early 300s, the Roman Empire had many different religions. Emperor Constantine could have chosen any of them to be the official religion. There was Manichaeism, Mithraism, and even Buddhism. Why did he pick Christianity? We don't really know. Maybe he liked it, maybe he thought it would help keep the peace, or maybe he just thought it was growing fast. Historians can guess, but they can't be certain. It's easy to look back and say, of course Christianity became the main religion. But at the time, it wasn't so clear. Harari explains the difference between describing how something happened and explaining why. Describing how is like telling a story of events, what happened, when, and where. Explaining why is much harder. It means figuring out the real reasons behind those events, and showing that those reasons were the only possible ones. Many scholars try to explain history by saying it's all about things like biology, nature, or money. But Harari believes that history is more complicated than that. The more you learn about a time period, the harder it becomes to say exactly why things turned out the way they did. He reminds us that even today, we can't predict the future. Will the economy get better or worse? Will China become the most powerful country? Will the world face big problems with the environment? There are many possibilities, and it's impossible to know for sure. People in the future will look back at our time and think the answers were obvious, just like we think the answers about the past are obvious now. Harari emphasizes that things that seem unlikely can sometimes happen. For example, Christianity started as a small group, and no one would have thought it would become the religion of a huge empire. Similarly, the Bolsheviks were a tiny group in Russia, and it would have seemed crazy to predict they would take over the country. Islam started as a small group of people in the desert, and it would have been hard to imagine they would conquer a huge area stretching from the ocean to India. Harari argues that while some things are predictable because of how the world works, there's still plenty of room for surprises. He also points out that history isn't necessarily about making things better for people. Cultures and ideas spread, but they don't always do so because they're good for us. Sometimes they spread because they're good at spreading. He uses the idea of memes to explain this. Memes aren't just funny pictures online. They're ideas that spread from person to person like a virus. Some memes are helpful, but others can be harmful. Cultures can be like that too. They can spread and become powerful, even if they're not the best for people. Think of nationalism, where people feel very strongly about their country. It can bring people together, but it can also lead to wars and conflict. Harari concludes that history is chaotic, meaning it's very complex and hard to predict. Many things are happening at once, and they all affect each other in complicated ways. Even small changes can lead to big differences in the future. He compares it to the weather. We can make predictions, but they're never perfect. He also uses the example of the stock market. If we could predict exactly what would happen, people would change their behavior and make the prediction wrong. So why study history? Not to predict the future, but to understand the present. By learning about the past, we can see that our world isn't the only possible world, and that we have more choices than we think. Studying how Europeans came to control Africa, for example, can help us realize that racial differences aren't natural or inevitable. History helps us open our minds and see that things could be different. Chapter 14, The Discovery of Ignorance. Yuval Noah Harari begins by painting a picture of how different the world was long ago. Imagine a Spanish farmer falling asleep in the year 1000 and waking up 500 years later, around the time Christopher Columbus set sail. He'd probably feel pretty comfortable. While things like clothes and tools might have changed a bit, the basic way of life wouldn't be too shocking. But if one of Columbus' sailors woke up today, with our phones and cars, he'd be completely lost. It would seem like a different planet. Harari explains that the last 500 years have seen a huge jump in what humans can do. Back in 1500, there were about 500 million people in the world. Now, there are over 7 billion. Think about how much stuff we make and sell. In 1500, it was a tiny amount compared to today. We use way more energy too. It's like we've become superpowered. To show just how much things have changed, Harari uses a fun example. Imagine a modern warship going back in time. It could easily destroy Columbus ships and defeat any army of that era without even getting scratched. Even a few big cargo ships could carry more goods than all the ships sailing around the world back then. A single computer could hold all the books and scrolls from every library in the Middle Ages and still have space left over. Banks today have more money than all the kings and queens of the past combined. Life in a city 500 years ago was very different too. Most cities weren't very big, and buildings were made of simple things like mud and wood. The streets were dirty and bumpy, filled with people, animals, and carts. It was noisy with voices and the sounds of tools. At night, everything went dark unless someone had a candle or torch. Can you imagine seeing a bright, bustling city like Tokyo or New York for the first time after living like that? Traveling around the world used to take a very long time. It took years for explorers like Magellan to sail around the globe, and many of them didn't survive the journey. Now, someone with a decent job can fly around the world in just 2 days. It's amazing to think that for most of history, humans were stuck on Earth. They could climb mountains, but the sky was for birds and legends. Then, in 1969, humans walked on the moon, a truly incredible achievement. Harari also talks about the tiny world of microorganisms. For a long time, people didn't even know these tiny creatures existed. It wasn't until someone looked through a microscope that they realized there was a whole universe of them. Now, we understand how these tiny organisms can make us sick, but also how they can help us with medicine and other things. But perhaps the most important moment in the last 500 years was the creation of the atomic bomb. It gave humans the power to change the world, but also the power to destroy it. This change, Harari says, was part of something called the scientific revolution. Before about the year 1500, people didn't really believe they could learn new things or become more powerful through science. They thought the wise people of the past had already figured everything out. Kings and leaders gave money to teachers and thinkers to keep things the way they were, not to discover new things. But after 1500, people started to believe that science could help them. They began investing in research, and the more they learned, the more they invested. This created a cycle where science led to new discoveries, which led to more investment, which led to even more discoveries. Harari points out that this belief in science is unique. Most cultures throughout history believed that all the important knowledge was already known. Religions like Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism taught that the gods or wise people of the past had already revealed everything we needed to know. But modern science is different. It's based on the idea that we don't know everything, and that even what we think we know might be wrong. Scientists are always questioning things and looking for new evidence. They use math to connect observations and create theories. And most importantly, they use these theories to create new technologies and gain new powers. This willingness to admit ignorance, combined with a focus on observation and math, is what makes modern science so powerful. Harari explains that science isn't just about learning facts, it's about gaining power. He quotes Francis Bacon, who said that knowledge is power. Scientists aren't just interested in understanding the world, they want to change it. This idea has led to incredible advancements, but it also presents a challenge. If we don't know everything, how can we make good decisions about how to run our societies? He suggests that we often rely on beliefs that aren't based on science, like the idea that all humans are equally valuable. He also notes that science itself relies on beliefs, like the belief that scientific research is worthwhile. Ultimately, Harari argues that modern culture has embraced ignorance to a greater degree than any culture before, and that this has allowed us to make incredible progress, even if it also creates new challenges. To make progress, science needs more than just research. It needs money, political support, and a strong economy. These things work together to create a cycle where science leads to new technologies, which leads to economic growth, which leads to more funding for science. It's a powerful combination that has transformed the world in just the last 500 years. Chapter 15: The Marriage of Science and Empire. Yuval Noah Harari explores a fascinating question. Why did people from a small island in Europe end up ruling much of the world? It seems strange, doesn't it? Not so long ago, Europe wasn't a big deal. Big empires like the Roman Empire got most of their riches from places like Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Northern Europe was seen as a wild and unimportant place. Even before modern times, empires usually took over nearby lands. The Romans conquered places close to them, and the Mongols did the same. They didn't usually travel far to conquer new lands. But around 1500, something changed in Europe. It started becoming a place of new ideas, new governments, and new ways of doing things. Over the next 250 years, Europeans started exploring and taking over lands in the Americas and across the oceans. Even though powerful empires like China and the Ottoman Empire were much stronger at the time, Europeans managed to conquer America and control the seas. It wasn't because they had better weapons right away. It was because they were really interested in finding out new things and taking over new lands. Think about how explorers like Christopher Columbus sailed to find new routes to Asia. He thought he was going to Asia, but he bumped into America instead. He didn't realize he'd found a whole new continent. A mapmaker named Martin Waldseemüller realized Columbus had discovered something completely new and named it America, after the explorer Amerigo Vespucci. This was a big shift in thinking. Europeans started drawing maps with blank spaces, admitting they didn't know everything. This curiosity and desire to explore were key to their success. Harari points out that European explorers and scientists often went hand in hand. When Napoleon invaded Egypt, he brought a bunch of scientists with him to study the land, its history, and its people. Even the famous Charles Darwin, who came up with the theory of evolution, went on a voyage around the world to collect plants and animals. These scientists helped the empires understand the lands they were conquering, making it easier to control them. It wasn't just about exploring and conquering. It was also about understanding the world. Europeans started studying languages, cultures, and even the tiniest creatures like spiders. They wanted to know everything about the places they took over. William Jones, a British judge in India, studied ancient languages like Sanskrit and realized they were related to languages in Europe. This helped people understand the history of different cultures. Harari also talks about how Europeans believed they were superior to other people, which is a really sad and unfair idea. Some people even use science to try and prove that Europeans were a master race. This led to terrible things, like the idea that Europeans had the right to rule over other people. Thankfully, we now know that everyone is equal, no matter where they come from. He explains that the European empires weren't just about being mean or taking over. They also brought new things like medicine, education, and better ways of doing things. But it's important to remember that these benefits often came at a high cost for the people who were conquered. The empires changed the world in many ways, and even today, many of the things we do, how we think, how we dress, how we run our businesses are influenced by European ideas. Harari concludes that the rise of Europe and its empires wasn't just about technology or military power. It was about a particular mindset, a combination of curiosity, ambition, and a willingness to admit ignorance. It was also about capitalism, which is a system where people are motivated to make money and create new things. These things combine to create a powerful force that shaped the modern world. He suggests that even though Europe isn't the most powerful place anymore, the ideas of science and capitalism are still very important and continue to change the world. Chapter 16, The Capitalist Creed. Yuval Noah Harari begins to tell a big story, the story of all humankind. It's a story that goes way back, long before there were countries, cities, or even farms. For most of human history, people were hunter-gatherers, moving around and finding food wherever they could. They lived in small groups and knew a lot about plants and animals. Imagine knowing exactly which berries were safe to eat and how to track a deer through the forest. That's the kind of knowledge our ancestors had. But around 12,000 years ago, something amazing happened. People in different parts of the world started to learn how to farm. Instead of chasing animals for food, they started planting seeds and growing crops. This was a huge change. Suddenly, people could stay in one place and grow their own food. This meant they didn't have to move around as much, and villages started to pop up. Farming also meant they could store food, so they didn't have to worry about starving during the winter. With settled villages came other changes. People started to build houses, make pottery, and weave cloth. They also started to have more babies because they had a more reliable food supply. As villages grew, they sometimes joined together to form larger communities. This led to the development of social structures, like chiefs and leaders, who helped organize the people and make decisions. Harari explains that farming wasn't just about growing food. It changed the way people thought about the world. They started to believe in gods and spirits connected to the land and the seasons. They built temples and created rituals to please these gods and ensure a good harvest. This was the beginning of religion, which has played a huge role in human history ever since. As communities grew even bigger, they started to trade with each other. People would exchange goods. They had an abundance for things they needed. For example, a village near the sea might trade fish for grain from a village inland. This trade helped spread new ideas and technologies, and it also led to the development of money. Instead of bartering, trading one thing for another, people could use money to buy and sell goods. Over time, some communities became more powerful than others. They started to conquer their neighbors and build empires. Empires are large groups of people and lands ruled by a single leader or government. Think of the Roman Empire, which controlled a huge area of Europe and the Mediterranean. Empires brought wealth and power to their rulers, but they also often led to conflict and oppression. Harari points out that all these changes farming, villages, trade. Empires were driven by a desire for more. People wanted more food, more land, more power, and more wealth. This desire for more has shaped human history in countless ways, both good and bad. It has led to incredible innovations and advancements, but it has also caused wars, suffering, and environmental destruction. He argues that the agricultural revolution, while it allowed for bigger populations and more complex societies, also trapped humans in a new kind of system. Instead of being free to roam and follow their instincts, people became dependent on farming and the social structures that came with it. They had to work hard to grow food, obey their leaders, and conform to social norms. It was a trade-off, more security and comfort in exchange for freedom and flexibility. Harari concludes that the story of humankind is a story of constant change and adaptation. From hunter-gatherers to farmers, from villages to empires, humans have always found ways to transform their world and themselves. But this transformation has come at a cost, and the future of humankind depends on whether we can learn from the past and create a more sustainable and equitable world. The story isn't over, and we are all writing the next chapter. Chapter 17: The Wheels of Industry. Yuval Noah Harari begins by explaining that our modern world grows because we trust that things will keep getting better, and because people who make money want to use that money to build more businesses. But that's not quite enough. To keep growing, we also need energy and materials like metal and wood. The problem is, these things aren't endless. If we run out, everything could fall apart. However, Harari points out that history shows us something surprising. Even though we use more energy and materials than ever before, we actually have more available. Whenever we start to worry about running out, clever people invent new ways to find and use what we have, or even discover completely new things. It's like when you think you're out of paper, but then you find a hidden stack. He uses the example of cars to show this. Think about how cars have changed over the last 300 years. We started with simple carts pulled by animals, and now we have super-fast jets and rockets. You might think we'd have used up all the materials needed to make all those vehicles. But instead, we've found new materials like plastic, rubber, aluminum, and titanium, things our ancestors never even knew existed. We also use new kinds of power, like electricity and nuclear energy, instead of just relying on horses and people. This big change is what we call the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, people knew how to use things like wood for fire and wind to sail boats. But these had limits. Trees weren't everywhere, the wind didn't always blow, and water power only worked near rivers. Plus, people couldn't easily change one type of energy into another. They couldn't use the heat from a fire to make something move, for example. The only thing that could do that was a person or animal, using their muscles. Almost everything people did depended on muscle power, and that muscle power came from plants. Plants use sunlight to grow, and that energy then got passed on to people and animals when they ate the plants. So, for thousands of years, human life was closely tied to the growing seasons and the sun. When the sun shone and crops grew, people had plenty of energy. When it was cold and dark, things were much harder. Harari then talks about something we all see every day: boiling water. For thousands of years, people boiled water in kettles, and the lid would jump up and down. They saw this happen, but they didn't realize it was a way to turn heat into movement. It was a missed opportunity. The idea of turning heat into movement really started to take off with gunpowder, invented in China. At first, people used it for fire bombs, but eventually, they realized it could be used to power cannons. It took a long time, but people slowly started to understand that heat could be used to make things move. A big breakthrough came in Britain when people started burning coal to heat their homes because they ran out of wood. When coal mines flooded, they needed a way to pump the water out. That's when someone invented the steam engine. It used heat from burning coal to boil water, and the steam pushed a piston, which made things move. This was a huge deal. The steam engine wasn't very efficient at first, but it was useful because coal was plentiful. Soon, people figured out how to use steam engines to power machines in factories, making cloth, and other goods much faster. This led to even more inventions, like trains and ships powered by steam. Suddenly, people were obsessed with finding ways to turn different kinds of energy into movement. Scientists started thinking about the energy stored inside tiny atoms and quickly figured out how to use it to make electricity and even powerful weapons. The internal combustion engine, which uses gasoline, changed transportation forever. Even electricity, which was once just a curiosity, became essential for everything we do. Harari argues that we aren't running out of energy. We're just not clever enough to use all the energy that's available. The sun gives us a huge amount of energy every day, far more than we could ever use. We're surrounded by other sources of energy too, like the power of the ocean. He also explains that we've solved the problem of running out of materials in the same way, by inventing new materials and finding new ways to use the ones we have. For example, aluminum used to be incredibly rare and expensive, but now we produce tons of it every year. Even things we use every day, like hand cream, are made with ingredients that were discovered or invented relatively recently. Harari concludes by saying that the Industrial Revolution has been all about learning how to turn energy into movement. This has led to incredible advances in farming, where machines and new techniques have allowed us to produce more food than ever before. This has also changed how we treat animals, often seeing them as machines to produce food rather than living creatures with feelings. Ultimately, Harari suggests that our ability to harness energy and create new materials has led to a world where we produce more than we can use, and that has created a new challenge: convincing people to buy all this stuff. He believes that our modern world is driven by a combination of wanting to make money and wanting to buy things, and that this has changed our values and how we live. Chapter 18, A Permanent Revolution. Yuval Noah Harari begins by describing how humans have changed the world around them. Long ago, people depended on nature for everything: food, shelter, and even the time of day. But the Industrial Revolution changed all that. People started building factories, railroads, and big cities. This meant cutting down forests and changing rivers to fit what humans needed. Sadly, this also meant that many animals lost their homes, and some even disappeared forever. Harari points out that there are a lot more humans and farm animals than wild animals these days. Think about it, there are billions of people and cows, pigs, and chickens, but only a few 100,000 wolves, chimpanzees, or giraffes left. Humans have really taken over the planet. He explains that even though we might worry about running out of things like water or metal, the real problem is hurting the environment. We might find new ways to get energy and materials, but we could also be destroying the natural world and causing animals to go extinct. Harari worries that messing with nature too much could even be dangerous for humans. Things like global warming and pollution could make the Earth a less friendly place to live. He says that humans are powerful, but sometimes our actions have unexpected and bad consequences. It's like trying to fix one problem and accidentally creating another, even bigger one. He uses the example of how dinosaurs disappeared a long time ago when an asteroid hit Earth. That made way for mammals, like us, to become the most important animals. He suggests that something similar might happen to humans, but hopefully not because of our own mistakes. Despite all this, Harari believes humans aren't going to disappear anytime soon. He shows how quickly the human population has grown over the last few hundred years. It used to be only a few 100 million people in the world, but now there are almost 7 billion. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how we make things, it also changed how we live our lives. Before factories, people followed the rhythms of nature. Farmers worked when the seasons changed, and there weren't strict schedules. People knew when to plant and harvest by watching the sun and the plants. But factories needed everyone to work at the same time, following a strict schedule. Harari uses the example of making shoes. A long time ago, a shoemaker would make an entire shoe, from start to finish. If he was late, it didn't matter much. But in a factory, each person only does one small part of the shoe on an assembly line. If one person is late, the whole line stops. So everyone has to be on time, following a set schedule. This idea of schedules spread to schools, hospitals, and even stores. To keep track of time, people needed clocks. Before, towns used their own time, which could be different from other towns. But when trains started running, that became a problem. Trains needed to run on a set schedule, so everyone agreed to use the same time, based on a place called Greenwich. Now we look at clocks all day long, on our wrists, phones, and even microwaves, because almost everything we do is timed. Harari explains that this focus on time and schedules has changed society in many ways. Families and communities used to be the most important parts of people's lives. They took care of each other, provided jobs, and helped each other out. But as factories and governments grew stronger, they started taking over some of those roles. People began to rely more on the government and the market to provide for their needs. He describes how families and communities used to be like a one-stop shop for everything. If you were sick, your family would take care of you. If you needed a loan, you'd ask your neighbors. But now we go to doctors, banks, and schools, all separate from our families. Even when we get married, it's often the market that influences who we choose, with dating apps and fashion trends shaping our ideas of what's attractive. Harari also points out that governments are now more involved in our lives than ever before. They tell us what to learn in school, and they even have rules about how parents should raise their children. He says that humans have created imagined communities, like countries and companies, that make us feel connected to people we don't even know. We feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves, even though we might not know most of the people in that group. Finally, Harari notes that things are changing so quickly these days that it's hard to keep up. He says that the world is always changing, and it's hard to predict what the future will be like. He suggests that while things might seem scary sometimes, humans have a remarkable ability to adapt and create new ways of living. He ends on a thoughtful note, wondering if we are heading towards a better future or a worse one, and acknowledging that the choice is still up to us. Chapter 19, And They Lived Happily Ever After. Yuval Noah Harari begins by pointing out how much the world has changed in the last 500 years. He describes a time of incredible progress. We've connected the whole planet, become much wealthier, and invented amazing things like electricity and computers. Because of science and industry, humans have become incredibly powerful. But Harari asks a big question: has all this progress actually made us happier? He wonders if having lots of stuff and powerful technology really brings contentment. He goes even further back in time, thinking about the 70,000 years since humans first started using their brains in special ways. Did all that time of learning and building make the world a better place to live? He poses a thought-provoking idea. Was Neil Armstrong, the first person to walk on the moon, truly happier than a hunter-gatherer who lived tens of thousands of years ago and left a handprint on a cave wall? If not, what was the point of all the inventions and changes we've made throughout history? Harari notes that most historians don't usually ask these kinds of questions. They study things like politics, economics, and how societies have changed, but they rarely ask if people were happier before or after those changes. He believes that many of the ideas we have about what makes us happy, like believing that being your own country or having a communist government will make everyone happy, or that money and free markets are the answer, might not be true. Harari imagines what would happen if scientists proved that these ideas were wrong. What if having lots of money didn't actually make people happier? What if people living in big empires were actually happier than people in independent countries? He suggests that we might have to rethink some of our beliefs about freedom and self-determination. He points out that historians have studied almost everything about the past, except how those things affected people's happiness. While many people have their own ideas about what makes them happy, Harari argues that we often assume that as time goes on, people become happier because we become more capable. We learn new skills and build better things, so we should be happier, right? However, Harari challenges this idea. He explains that just because we become more powerful doesn't mean we become happier. For example, when people first started farming, they became more powerful because they could grow their own food. But farming also meant harder work, less varied diets, and more diseases. Similarly, empires spread ideas and technology, but that didn't always mean good things for the people they conquered. He suggests that having more power doesn't automatically lead to happiness. Some people believe the opposite, that having more power actually makes us less happy. They think that humans were meant to live like hunter-gatherers, and that farming and industry have created a world that doesn't suit our natural instincts. They romanticize the idea of a simple life, imagining that a successful mammoth hunt was more joyful than anything we experience today. Harari disagrees with both of these extreme views. He acknowledges that new skills and technologies can be harmful, but he also points out that we've learned to use our abilities more wisely over time. Modern medicine, for example, has dramatically reduced child mortality, which is a huge improvement. Violence and wars have also decreased, and we're better at preventing famines. However, Harari cautions that it's too early to say whether these recent improvements represent a lasting change. He worries that we might be damaging the environment and using up resources in ways that will cause problems in the future. He also reminds us that we often only think about the happiness of people in wealthy countries, forgetting about the experiences of people in the past or in other parts of the world. He uses the example of Truganini, an Aboriginal Australian, to emphasize that everyone's story is important. Harari then moves on to discuss how we measure happiness. He explains that psychologists and scientists try to study happiness by asking people how they feel. They use questionnaires to find out if there's a connection between happiness and things like money, health, or family. One interesting finding is that money does make people happier, but only up to a certain point. Once you have enough money to meet your basic needs, more money doesn't make much difference. He also notes that family and community are very important for happiness. People with strong families and supportive communities tend to be happier than people who are isolated. But perhaps most importantly, Harari explains that happiness often depends on our expectations. If you expect to get a fancy car and you only get a used one, you'll be disappointed. But if you expected nothing at all, you might be happy with the used car. Harari concludes by suggesting that we might be misled by modern media and advertising, which create unrealistic expectations about what will make us happy. He also points out that even if we invent ways to live forever, it might not make us happier. He argues that we need to understand ourselves better and question our assumptions about what truly matters in life. He suggests that perhaps, instead of chasing fleeting pleasures, we should focus on understanding the truth about ourselves and the world around us. Chapter 20, The End of Homo Sapiens. Yuval Noah Harari began by explaining that understanding humans means looking at how we fit into the world around us. He said that just like plants and animals, we are also affected by the rules of physics, chemistry, and how living things change over time, what scientists call natural selection. For a long time, people thought humans couldn't really change those basic rules. We were stuck with what nature gave us. But Harari suggests that things are changing, and humans are starting to take control of their own evolution. He used the example of giraffes to show how natural selection works. Giraffes didn't decide to grow long necks. Instead, giraffes with slightly longer necks were able to reach more food, so they had more babies. Over many, many years, this led to giraffes having very long necks. It wasn't a plan, just a slow change over time. Tiny creatures like germs can sometimes share information and change, but they don't really think or plan. Even clever animals like Neanderthals couldn't change things much. They could dream of easy meals, but they still had to hunt. The first small step towards changing things happened around 10,000 years ago with farming. People started noticing that if they picked the biggest pumpkins or the friendliest sheep to have babies, their next generation of pumpkins and sheep would be even bigger and friendlier. It was like a slow, human-made version of natural selection. But even then, humans couldn't create something completely new. They could only work with what already existed. Now things are different. Scientists can now change living things in ways that were once impossible. Harari described a scientist who created a bright green rabbit. He took a gene from a jellyfish that glows and put it into a rabbit's egg. The result was a rabbit that glowed green. This wasn't something that happened naturally. It was designed by a person. This shows that humans are starting to replace natural selection with intelligent design, meaning we're starting to plan and create life instead of just letting it happen on its own. Harari pointed out that people often disagree with this kind of science. Some worry that humans shouldn't be playing God. Others worry about hurting animals or creating unfair advantages for some people. But scientists are still working on these new technologies, and they are exploring different ways to change life. They're not just changing animals. They're also working on ways to improve human bodies and minds, and even create new forms of life that aren't based on the same building blocks as plants and animals. He gave examples of how scientists are already changing things. They're engineering cows to produce milk that fights disease, pigs to produce healthier meat, and even bacteria to make fuel. Scientists are also trying to bring back extinct animals, like mammoths, by mixing their DNA with elephant DNA. And some scientists are even trying to create artificial brains using computers. Harari then discussed the possibility of creating superhumans, people with enhanced abilities and longer lives. He wondered if we could engineer people to be smarter, more loyal, or even to have different emotions. He acknowledged that this raises big questions about what it means to be human and what kind of society we want to create. He suggested that we need to think carefully about what we want to become, not just what we can become. He concluded by saying that the changes happening now are so big that they might be the most important changes in the history of life on Earth. He compared it to the Big Bang, a moment when the rules of the universe changed forever. He warned that these changes could be scary, but also that they could lead to a future beyond our wildest imaginations. He urged people to think about these possibilities and to consider what kind of future they want to create. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.